Hello, this is the RPG Pundit, the final boss in Internet Shitlords, and here's Domino. And I know what Domino's waiting for, so I better give it to her. Whenever I make coffee, she gets a little cap full of milk there. It's all right. I know some people are going to say you're not supposed to give cats milk, but if a cat's been drinking milk from infancy and doesn't stop, it isn't a problem. It's not in a small amount like this, okay? So let's no one have a cow. Unless it's a milk cow. Give me 1 second, guys. I gotta prepare my coffee here. And today, I am going to be talking about some debating that I have recently done on X that shows me that even many people who are into the OSR have got a really weird notion of what we do, of what we're supposed to do. So, just want to say, oh, no, you can't drink that milk. That's the milk for my coffee. Jesus Christ, cat. Cat, stop misbehaving. This crazy kitten. There we go. I don't think you're going to want it now. Put turmeric in there. All right. Now. So, I was on X, and let me just turn on X here so I can refer to some of the conversation. And there have been certain people whose name will not be said here for the purposes of saving them some of their shame, that are arguing that essentially the OSR is useful for creating story, or they might call it narrative, as if that makes a difference. And I am here to disavow that. And it shows that there's, even now, there are still people who have a perspective that has been largely ruined by the influx of the kind of storytelling and story gaming movement. And they even see this propaganda that has been built up, essentially, regarding the significance of story. And they're convinced that that is what you're supposed to do as a DM. And now this is not necessarily about, however, people engaging in like railroading or stuff like that, right? It's that is the most blatant example you could say of story gaming, but it's not really the only way to screw up making a campaign. So I'm well known for having very, very long-term campaigns. I've been running my Baptism of Fire campaign for many years now. And even longer than that, my Sword and Caravan campaign. And of course, the Last Sun campaign has been going on for 14 years. And that is not because I act like the writer of a novel or the director of a movie or a TV show or the creator of a comic book or something like that. It's because of the effect of creating a living world. And you do not want to have a narrative agenda in a living world. One example of this is the recent video I did where we talked about the difference, how some people also thought that this thing that happened in Critical Role where the DM said, well, you don't even have to do a roll, you just do your speech and it's going to be so awesome. That is the same as what people do in the OSR. No, it's not supposed to be that at all, right? Not that you don't do speeches. Of course, you can have characters that do speeches. But this idea that you should, that it should be left into like some of what is best for the story, which is essentially what the argument of the DM of the latest DM of Critical Role was arguing. And that is where the mistake happens. But it's worse. There are some people that have this idea that, like, even in like, I was having this debate, believe it or not, that in combat, narrative interest should reign. There was somebody who was suggesting, for example, that hit points are actually a narrative tool. They're actually a story tool, right? Because what do hit points represent? Well, I can tell you what hit points represent. They are an actual in-world mechanic, right? And that is where the difference is where the difference lies, okay? If you are using a mechanic that reflects what is happening inside your game world, it is a real thing in the game world, and therefore not a part, it shouldn't be a part of the story unless your whole world is a story, and that's where you get into real trouble. So the mechanic of hit points is how much physical injury your character is capable of withstanding. And if you as a DM say, well, you know, it doesn't matter, you know, okay, so you got like minus 10 hit points, but it was so cool what you did, I'm going to make you live, right? And then that destroys the entire sense of it being a real world. So if a campaign is not supposed to be a story, what is it supposed to be? Well, the answer is that it is supposed to be a virtual world. It is supposed to be a world that in a virtual sense really exists and has real rules, and has a real structure to it. And one where the DM is not some kind of demiurge who introduces things because it'll seem cool, right, or something like that. The cool part of a world should be the world itself, right? If you have a boring world, then, and I mean, if you created it, that's on you, right? and if somebody else created it, I guess that's on them, but it's also on you for making it, right? But if instead, as a DM, you allow the world to exist, and you allow the world, you have a good understanding of the world you're running, and so you know why everything should happen in it, and you've created an adequate amount of preparation in terms of knowing, what the world is like, its geography, its history, its personalities, the characters that are in it, the factions that are in it, the culture that is in it, all of that sort of stuff. Then the way that you should play is that the world should play itself, right? You shouldn't be deciding on the basis of you saw a really interesting episode of Star Trek last night or something like that. You should be deciding on the basis of how do I do my best to emulate this particular type of world. How do I make that come alive? So no, hit points are not a narrative mechanic. A narrative mechanic is, on the contrary, something that exists at the player level, at something that has no real meaning in the game level. So, for example, fate points, right, or something like that, where I was mortally wounded, but I spend a fate point as a player, and now my character is still alive, right? That is a narrative mechanic. It's a bad mechanic because it doesn't actually reflect any of the realities of the game world that you are playing in. Now, some game worlds might have tougher people in it, or some might not. Some might have greater risk of mortality, and others might have lesser risk of mortality. All of those things can happen, The point is that as a DM, what you want to do is create a world where you are a clockmaker god, right? You are only acting in the way that you feel the world should act, without concern about trying to intentionally create a story. Now, obviously, in that world, if you're making a good game world, it should have all kinds of potential action that can happen. That is the nature of a sandbox game. In a sandbox game, you have all these things. There are places where there are monsters. There are things where there's like evil people in it. There's, political tensions. There's all these things. And depending on the timeline of your world and depending on the actions of the players, different things will come into play, So like, this is, I've often said about that story, the role of story in RPGs is essentially an incidental byproduct. You don't do stories that are front-loaded. You play. And in essence, everything that happens could be some kind of story. Most of them might be kind of boring stories. But in RPGs, very often, you get stories that result out of the actions of play, right? You don't make them while they are happening. While they're happening, you're playing in a living world, right? And that's the way it should look like, because that means that your players can feel that their character is a living character, not just a set piece for the DM to play, not some kind of movie character that you're playing the role of, and especially not some kind of bit actor who's there to watch all the cool things the DM does, right? That's the worst. So what you need to do is create that environment that the world feels like a real world. The players can understand it. You as the DM, you don't have to front load them with every bit of knowledge of the world, but what you should do is make sure that in any situation, they understand what the context is within the world that their character would know or understand, right? So different characters might know different things about the world, sure. The moment the story becomes the thing in all this, that becomes what you as a DM are doing, the world stops being real. Because you know that anything that happens in the world from then on could be edited out with story, right? It could be changed with story, where story takes precedent over your characters being real and the world being real. So if that's the campaign you make, it means that your players end up understanding that they can't really be sure how anything will work out apart from the DM's divine fiat. And anything that the characters do inside the world is essentially thus meaningless because the DM could undo it, So you need to create characters, NPCs, societies, factions. The world has to have both a history and possibly you could have a potential timeline of how things will go in the near future without the interference of the players, understanding that if the player characters are able to change things, you have to change things as well, right? And in actual play, the best way to do this, and one of the best ways to avoid being caught up in being a story maker, which is not the role of a DM, is to make use of random generators and ongoing events and encounters that you do not entirely control, right? And so like in Baptism of Fire and in Sword and Caravan and in the Last Vikings and in my upcoming games also, I make great use of these random generators. As a DM, I'm talking about when I'm running games, so that, and that has the benefit for you as a DM that you also don't know exactly what's going to happen. And that is great. That's a wonderful thing for a DM because the DM himself will be surprised by it. I've mentioned many times before that my players, for example, when I started my Sword and Caravan campaign, some of my players believed that I was preparing the whole adventure beforehand that they just played in this session. I had to explain to them, no, I didn't do that. I mean, I know what time period you're in. I know where you are in the world. And everything else was done largely by random generators and by the decisions that you guys made. You decided to go up into the mountains to find the ruined city. Okay, that's fine. That's your choices. And then from there, everything else was derived, right? And of course, yes, I knew what was in the ruined city. But the way that you guys did things was just as a reaction to the environment of the world, not to some kind of plot line that I tried to create, you know. So that is a real living world, and that makes it a living world for you, and it makes it a living world for the players. And then the players' characters become living people in that living world, which creates immersion for the player. And then after those events take place, after the end of that session, if it was a good session, there is a story, of course, the story of the adventure you just went through, the session you just went through. And some of those are going to be very interesting stories, right? And usually, when you think about it, I mean, if you've used, like, for example, modules or adventures, especially ones that have kind of a predictable timeline or a predictable story path or something like that, you could say, oh yeah, that was okay, that was fun, right? But in my experience as a DM, and this is part of what led me more and more towards this position, the adventures that my long-term players think back to and remember are the ones where it wasn't what was in the in the plot line of the adventure. It was where things went different. Because a living world, a virtual living world, can make more varied and more interesting adventures than a regular adventure writer could make. So that's kind of the key to the thing. That if you trust your world, it'll create and your players have bought into the world, it'll create a better type of story. So what I do is I create characters, NPCs, a society, factions, a world that has history, a potential timeline. That's how you make a living world, okay? And that is what it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be a virtual reality, a reality that when you're at the moment you're playing in, you want to imagine it to be real, right? To be a real world, not the background story of a fantasy novel or something like that, So this is the value of creating a living world and then trusting that world, if you can run it effectively, and again, random generators are a great help for this. You can definitely get a lot of them in my games, but there are lots of other people who also have good random generators in their games or their campaign books or what have you. Make use of those resources, and you have to want to treat it in that context. This is like also part of why a lot of the RPGs that are based on fiction products can have certain difficulties, right? Obviously, the superhero genre in general has huge problems with this because, in a way, it's very difficult to capture the style. Like, let's say you're playing like classic sort of superheroes, right? Like the Justice League or something like that. It's very hard to stay true, not to the to some of the conceits of the game, right? Because in DC superheroes, Superman and Batman are the greatest superheroes, right? And one of them is practically a god, and the other one's a guy with a bunch of gadgets and who's very smart, right? And yet those two, if there's a Superman versus Batman fight, and there have been some of them in comics, right? That is epic, right? Whereas if Superman is fighting just some other guy with gadgets, right? Wipe the floor with him, right? So this is what because that is part of a kind of a mythic element to it, and so you'd always have to try to mechanize that mythic element to make it work, right? Likewise, campaigns set in like Star Wars, Star Trek, or Doctor Who all have specific sort of difficulties, right? I helped to make the was it Cubicle 7 or Modiphius? I forget which one it was now. But the most recent Doctor Who game, I played a part in the in the creation of the game. And of course, I think it's a very good Doctor Who game. But that's Doctor Who has a massive problem, right? Because you could be a companion or you could be a Time Lord, right? But there's only one Doctor, right? Like the Doctor, right? It's a one-man story, actually, right? And if you don't have the Doctor there at all, you're not really playing Doctor Who. Even if you're playing all the rest of the Doctor Who universe, it becomes a completely different game, right? Probably one that would be more playable without Doctor Who than with him in it, right? But if you are playing Doctor Who, you need someone who can actually embody Doctor Who, and that's also very difficult. Star Trek and Star Wars are not quite as difficult because they have ensemble casts and what have you. But even there, like, you know, in the when Wizards did its Star Wars game, they obviously kind of realized this, maybe subconsciously. I don't know if it was a conscious choice, but they did this advertising campaign where they'd show like a picture of the whole, Republic Senate or something like that, and they would point an arrow to some random alien and go, "What's this guy's story?" Right? And the reason they were doing that is because, of course, it still has the problem, right, that the protagonists, Star Wars, Star Trek to a lesser degree, but in a similar, but not entirely dissimilar, and Doctor Who are all myths rather than worlds, right? The worlds then grew around them, yes, and there's other fiction. So, like, for example, if you were doing an Andor type story in Star Wars, you can do that. That can potentially work, right? But it means that it should have different rules than the rules that you see kind of inherent in the story of A New Hope, right? Because that is not the standard, really, right? That is the exceptional myth of Star Wars. So it doesn't really work if you're trying to parse that into an RPG. If in that case you would have to retell the story basically, and that's already been done. So that makes it very complicated for some of these games that are based on licensed products. If you are trying to make story in the game, right, like during the game, rather than story as a byproduct of the game, what you essentially do is that the story becomes like a tombstone, both in the sense of an epitaph and in the sense of brevity. The story is only something that can actually exist after the events happen, not while it's happening. A narrative is a conflation of events meant to convince you of something that is not real. And by it not being real, it loses the purpose of why you are playing in that world. So if you try to run your RPG as a story or as a narrative, what you're essentially doing is making your campaign a kind of undead thing. Like it's already all been predetermined, right? And it isn't going to come out right. If you actually want to generate great story out of RPGs, you have to not focus on the story. You have to focus on the environment and the world and the events that happen in it. And there, in that context, the history of what has happened, right? History is something that in one sense, yes, is made after the fact, but it is made in the faithful reproduction of the events that have happened, right? In the most faithful possible reproduction, though obviously history gets warped in the telling after the story, right? Like the legends of certain people get bigger, some things are forgotten, some things are ignored, some things are covered up, and what have you, right? But that's normal for story, right? And eventually, people who might have been great heroes in ancient times might become demigods or gods or something like that in the story that comes after their lives. Whereas if you went back and looked at the real guy, he wouldn't look the same way, right? But that is a big part of it. So what you want to do is have an interesting world. And if you have an interesting world and you allow randomness to happen, you allow the unexpected to happen, right? Obviously, you want to parse that randomness in the right way. That you want to make good probability types, right? Where there's a very low possibility that your player characters will be in the central part of a kingdom and come across a dragon, right? That should be an incredibly rare event. If you're going out into the perilous mountains, there's probably a bigger chance you'll get a dragon. It still probably shouldn't be as big as your chance of finding other monsters there and things like that, right? And you have to think through, if you're going to try your hand at making random generators, you have to think through what should the probabilities be and what should be there and shouldn't be there depending on the region or the time or the situation or the context of the place that you're using that generator for. This is why like purely generic generators are not particularly useful unless you're in a very unusual world. But if you do this, then you will find that there will be sessions that are going to have more mundane but exciting play, right? Your characters still won't know what's coming, and neither will you. And then there are going to be other sessions where some really incredible thing might happen that will be a very memorable story because it is one of those lower probability chances, right? And other sessions still where generators that you could have of other types of like groups of things, of plots or whatever, could create a whole new faction or situation in the campaign that goes on after that, right? That it continues in some way. And these are the things that make your world feel alive. Unpredictability is extremely important for verisimilitude, right? Because the real world is more unpredictable than stories. Stories are predictable within the mind of the creator of the story, whereas leaving it to actual reality will have unintended consequences that nobody would have expected. And that actually is what makes your world come alive, and that what makes your players want to keep playing in it. Because ultimately there's only so many stories that you can tell that one person can come up with, right? And you might, from time to time get some new idea or something. But creating a mechanic for universal events that can provide unexpected developments that you would not be able, that would be outside of something that you would ever have conceived of just by your own thoughts, okay? So that is what you need to do if you are running a proper RPG of any kind, but especially an OSR game. And I can tell you from my own experience that is a big part of what allows campaigns to not go stale. Not that there aren't sometimes slower progress or faster progress, but there's always going to be something. If you're running it the proper way, there's always going to be something that can come up at the moment that you need to look at what is going on in the world, right? And then that will produce new developments for your campaign world. All right. So check out Baptism of Fire, my incredible early medieval RPG. The Last Vikings, which is a separate campaign setting, but it's in the same time period as Baptism of Fire. If you want to play some Vikings, it's an excellent book. The Old School Companion 1 that gives you all kinds of great ideas. All three of these have great random generators that give you some great ideas for generating material and also other things, magic and magic items and monsters and elves and things like that have a real authentic medieval flavor. And be sure to check out all my other products. Hit like on this video. And be sure to check out the latest reissuing of the Pundit Files, which I think is Pundit Files 13 if I'm not mistaken. 12 or 13, I forget which one it is, but it's Medieval Authentic Traps. Okay? Because there are some crazy and wacky traps in D&D, and those are cool, right? They're very interesting. But I took the challenge of trying to make a book that would present what real traps could be like for kind of a more authentic feel based on actual traps that were created by different pre-industrial cultures in our world, as well as traps that they could have made, even if we don't know that they ever did, and of course some magical traps that have a very historically authentic flavor. So if you're looking for something like that, if you like traps and you want to do real old school traps check out that product. Or if not, check out any of the other 11 or 12 that have already come out in the Lixuni Gaming site. The link is going to be in the description below. The link to all of my books are in the description below. And be sure to check those out, okay? Currently smoking. This is Lorenzetti Half Volcano plus Argento Roots.